You are listening to Arama Never Sleep, the place where ordinary people face extraordinary family moments and answer them not with rage, but with receipts. Stay with me. My mother called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me that my father had changed his will. She didn't call to warn me. She called to explain why it was fair. I was standing in the parking garage of the hospital where I'd worked for 11 years, still in my scrubs, my shift badge clipped to my collar, my lunch bag in my hand, and she said, in the voice she used when she'd already decided something and needed me to understand it wasn't a discussion, "Your father has decided to leave the house and the business to Nathan. You'll get something, of course. We're not unreasonable people. But Nathan has been here, Maya. He's been present. You chose your path and it took you far away, and that's wonderful. It really is. But the family needs someone who stayed." I said, "Mom, I paid the mortgage on that house for 6 years. She said, "That was a loan, honey." I said, "Nobody ever called it a loan." She said, "We always intended to pay it back." What my mother didn't know, standing in her kitchen in the house I'd been paying for, was that the conversation she'd just had with me was the last one she'd ever have, where she held all the information and I held none of it. What she didn't know was what I'd found in my father's filing cabinet 14 months earlier, during the week I'd driven home to help after his surgery, when he'd asked me to find the insurance documents and I'd found something else entirely. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 14 months since that discovery doing exactly what she'd spent 34 years training me to do. Being quiet, being patient, doing the work nobody asked about. Welcome to Arama Never Sleep. My name is Maya Osei. I am 34 years old, and I am a cardiac nurse with 11 years of experience and a night shift schedule that means I have spent roughly a third of my adult life awake in the dark watching over other people's most fragile moments. This is the story of the family that spent 34 years treating my presence as a utility and my absence as a convenience, and what happened when I stopped being either. If you've ever been the one who holds everything together while everyone else holds the credit, stay with me. This one is for you. My parents came to the United States from Ghana in 1987. My father Emmanuel first, then my mother Abina 8 months later, with $40 between them and a cousin's couch in Queens to sleep on. My father has told this story at every family gathering for as long as I've been alive, and I want to be fair to him when I say it. The story is true, and it is remarkable. He built something from nothing in a country that gave him very little help doing it. I have never once doubted that the sacrifice was real. What I came to doubt, slowly, across 34 years of careful observation, was who exactly the sacrifice was supposed to benefit. Emmanuel Osei opened his first shop in 1991, a small grocery in the Bronx that sold West African foodstuffs, imported spices, dried fish, palm oil, the things that the Ghanaian community in the neighborhood needed and couldn't find anywhere else on the block. My mother worked the register from 6 in the morning until my father came in at noon, and my father worked until close, and on Sundays they both worked. And I know all of this, not because they told me, but because I was there, sitting behind the counter on a stack of palm oil boxes doing my homework by the light of the shop window from the time I was old enough to sit still and young enough that leaving me at home alone wasn't an option. I was the oldest by 4 years. Nathan came in 1993, a round-faced boy who from the very first week of his life on Earth received a quality of attention I had not previously understood was available in our household. I want to be precise about this, because I've spent a long time examining it and I don't want to make it sound like something it wasn't. My parents didn't dislike me. My mother braided my hair and packed my lunches and came to every school play I was in. My father taught me to ride a bike in the parking lot behind the shop and called me his smart girl with a pride that sounded genuine because it was. The problem was never that they didn't love me. The problem was structural. The problem was that in my parents' understanding of how a family worked, how a Ghanaian family worked, how any family built by two people who had survived genuine hardship and built something real from genuine nothing worked, there was a role for a daughter and a role for a son, and the roles were not equivalent, and nobody said this out loud, not even once, because in my family the things that mattered most were the things that were never said out loud. They were simply built into the architecture of every decision, the way load-bearing walls are built into a house. You don't see them. You just notice, eventually, that every room is shaped around them. Nathan got the bedroom with the window. I got the one beside the boiler. Nathan got the new backpack every September. I got his from the year before, which was fine, my mother said, because it still had plenty of use left in it. When Nathan broke his arm in 5th grade falling off the monkey bars, my parents closed the shop for 2 days to be with him at the hospital and take him home and settle him in and make sure he was comfortable. When I had my appendix out in 7th grade, my father drove me to the emergency room, signed the consent forms, told me to be brave, and went back to open the shop. My mother came that evening. I was in recovery by then. I don't tell these things to score points. I tell them because they accumulated over 17 years into a picture of my value to the family that was specific and consistent. And that picture shaped every decision I made from the time I was old enough to understand it. I decided at 15 that I would build something of my own that had nothing to do with my family's approval or my family's resources, because by 15 I had understood clearly that my family's resources were Nathan's resources, and I was welcome to benefit from the overflow. I studied. I studied the way people study when studying is the only lever they have full control over. I got a full scholarship to a state university 3 hours from the Bronx, and I took it without a second thought, and my father drove me to campus with my 2 bags in the trunk of his car and sat at the curb, gripping my shoulders with both hands. "You make us proud, Maya!" I believed he meant it. I still believe he meant it. The meaning of it just turned out to be narrower than I understood at 17. I chose nursing because I had sat in enough hospital waiting rooms by then to understand that the nurses were the ones who actually knew what was happening and could tell you the truth and held your hand when the truth was bad. And that seemed to me like the most important job in the building. I got my RN, then my BSN, then I sat for my CCRN certification for the cardiac intensive care unit, which is where the sickest hearts go. The ones that have already partially failed and need people who can read 12 simultaneous waveforms at 3 in the morning without losing their focus. I was good at it. I am good at it. I have a gift. My charge nurse told me in my 3rd year, for staying calm when everything is going wrong simultaneously, for keeping my hands steady and my voice level when the room is filling with exactly the kind of terror that makes other people's hands shake. I got that gift from my childhood. I moved to Philadelphia for a position at a cardiac center that was doing research. I wanted to be close to, and I built a life there the way I built everything. Quietly, methodically, with nobody watching or asking. I had an apartment I liked, friends I trusted, a savings account I added to every month without fail, because my mother's voice was in my head every time I thought about spending money, telling me that nothing lasts and you must be ready. A piece of advice she gave me freely and never seemed to apply to herself. I sent money home when it was needed, which was more often than I sometimes had available, because the shop had grown by then into 2 locations and a small wholesale arm, and my father had a way of calling about money that made it sound like he was calling about something else, about how business was difficult, about how the neighborhood had changed, about how Nathan was working so hard but the margins were tight, until at some point in the conversation I understood that he was describing a hole that he expected me to fill. I filled it, every time. Not because I was asked directly, which I almost never was, but because the hole was there and I could see it, and I am constitutionally incapable of watching a solvable problem go unsolved. That is the trait that made me a good nurse and a useful daughter, and for 34 years, a person whose usefulness was so reliable that nobody ever bothered to wonder what it was costing me. Nathan, in the meantime, was being trained. That's the word my father used, training, as though Nathan were an apprentice in a guild, and the guild were the only guild worth joining. He went to a local college on a combination of my parents' savings and a small loan that my father co-signed, and he studied business administration because my father said the shop needed someone with formal business knowledge, and after he graduated, he came into the shop officially, with a salary my parents paid him from the business accounts, and a title, operations manager, printed on business cards that sat in a little holder on the counter, and a new truck my father helped him buy because, my mother explained to me on the phone, Nathan needed to be able to make deliveries, and his old car wasn't reliable enough for that. I asked, once, whether I might have a role in the business, not because I wanted to work in a grocery, but because I was curious about whether the offer existed. My father said, and I am quoting him as precisely as I can from memory, "Maya, you have your career. You've built something for yourself. Why would you want to come back and do this? Nathan needs this. You don't need it. I don't need it." The sentence that defined my position in that family in 11 words. I was 31 years old. I had been a cardiac ICU nurse for 9 years. I had, without anyone asking and without anyone noticing, contributed somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 to my family over the previous decade, in wires and checks and deposits made quietly into my parents' account on the first of the month with a subject line that said just, "For the house," because I didn't know what else to call it. The house is the part I need to explain carefully, because the house is where everything that came later was rooted, and I want you to understand it exactly as it happened. My parents bought their house in 2003, a 3-bedroom in a Queens neighborhood that had not yet become expensive but was beginning to show signs of considering it. They bought it with a combination of savings and a mortgage, and for years they managed the payments themselves. And I knew this and was glad for it because it meant there was something in my family's financial life that didn't eventually migrate toward me. Then 2018 happened. The shop had a difficult year. Their primary supplier changed distribution contracts, and the margins on the wholesale arm collapsed in a single quarter. My father had also, without telling anyone, taken out a small business loan the year before to renovate the second location, and the renovation had run over budget the way renovations always run over budget. And the combination of those two things meant that by October of 2018, my parents were 3 months behind on the mortgage, and my father called me the way he called me when something was bad enough, that he had run out of other options. He told me they needed help. He didn't say how much. He asked if I was in a position to assist, which was the formal version of the question he asked when the informal version felt like too much to say out loud. I asked how much. He told me the number, $18,000 to bring the mortgage current and cover the next 3 months while the business stabilized. I had $22,000 in savings. It had taken me 4 years to save it. I wired $18,000 to my parents' account the following morning and told myself I'd rebuild it. In those 3 years, Nathan got a raise. In those 3 years, my father and Nathan flew to Ghana together to visit relatives and scout a possible import partnership, a trip I heard about when my mother mentioned it casually on a Sunday call, the way she mentioned things she assumed I already knew. In those 3 years, the truck Nathan drove was replaced with a newer one, also partially funded by the business. And Nathan moved from his apartment into the house with my parents because, my mother said, it was more convenient for his commute to the shop. Nathan was 30 years old and living with his parents for the convenience of the commute. I was 33 and living alone in Philadelphia and sending $400 a month to the house Nathan was conveniently commuting from. I drove home in September of 2022 because my father had a hip replacement and my mother called me and said she needed help. and I took a week of PTO and drove up on a Sunday and let myself in with my key and carried my bag upstairs to the room beside the boiler, which was still my room. The Christmas decorations stacked neatly on my childhood desk, and I got my father settled and comfortable and handled. The first few days of his recovery, with the specific competence that 11 years of caring for people post-surgery had given me. And on the third day, my father asked me from his recliner if I would look in the filing cabinet in his study for the insurance explanation of benefits. The filing cabinet was organized the way my father organized everything, by category, by year, labeled in his precise handwriting in black marker on manila folder tabs. Insurance was near the back. I flipped through the folders toward it, and my hand stopped on one that was labeled in the same black marker, in my father's same precise handwriting, Estate. UP dated 2022. I opened the folder. Inside was a will, updated, as the folder tab said, in 2022. My father's will, prepared by an attorney whose letterhead I didn't recognize, with a Queen's address. I read it the way I read a patient's chart, front to back, slowly, looking for the thing that matters. The house, valued in the document at $840,000 based on a recent appraisal, was left entirely to Nathan. The business, 2 shop locations, and the wholesale arm, valued in the document at approximately $320,000 in combined assets, was left entirely to Nathan. There was a checking account with a balance of approximately $60,000. It was split equally, $30,000 each. There was a note at the bottom of the primary distribution page, typed by the attorney and presumably reflecting my father's instructions. This distribution reflects the contributions of each child to the family's legacy. Nathan Emmanuel Osei has dedicated himself to the continuation of the family business and its presence in the community. Maya Abena Osei has built an independent life and career and is not dependent on the family's assets for her security. Not dependent on the family's assets for her security. I had wired $18,000 to keep those assets from going into foreclosure. I had sent $400 a month for 4 years, which is $19,200 to maintain the household those assets sat in. I had done this while building my independent life and career, which I had built independently because independence was the only mode available to me, not because anyone gave me the option of dependence and I declined it. I put the folder back exactly where I found it. I found the insurance documents, 2 folders further back, and I took them to my father and sat with him while he made the phone call about the copay. And then I made dinner and helped him to bed and sat in my childhood room beside the boiler and opened a new note on my phone and started writing down every number I could remember. For the next 14 months, I did 3 things. I documented everything. I learned everything. And I waited. I made a record of everything I had ever contributed to my family. I started with what I could prove: bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, text messages where my father or mother had described what money was needed for, emails where amounts were mentioned. $18,000, September 2018. Wire transfer confirmation, time-stamped. $400 monthly from January 2019 through November 2022. Bank statements showing 38 consecutive transfers, $15,200. Nathan's car repair, June 2020. A text from Nathan saying, "Sis, I'm so sorry to ask," and a Venmo receipt for $1,250. Shop, rent, November and December 2017. $4,400. When I added everything up for the first time, sitting at my kitchen table in Philadelphia on a Thursday evening in January 2023, the total was $41,680. $41,680 sent to a family that had valued my contributions at $30,000 in a will. I found an estate attorney named David Park, whose office was in Midtown, and I made an appointment for a Saturday morning in February and drove up from Philadelphia in the dark and sat across from him in a conference room while the city woke up outside the window and told him everything. He said, "Here's the honest picture. The will as written is legally sound. Your father has the right to distribute his estate as he sees fit, and courts are very reluctant to interfere with that right. The contributions you've made, without written loan agreements, are almost certainly going to be characterized as gifts in any legal proceeding. Gifts don't create enforceable claims against an estate." I said, "I understand," he said. "What you have is a moral case, not a legal one. What you may have, depending on how the next period of time unfolds, is leverage. Not in court, but in the room. If your parents are people who care what other family members think of them, if they have a community, a reputation, relationships that matter to them, then the truth about what you've contributed and what you've received is leverage. Because the truth, told to the right people at the right moment, changes what the room knows." I said, "Tell me about the leverage." The phone call my mother made in August came after a family gathering I hadn't attended, a cousin's graduation party in Queens where my father had sat with the family's elders and announced that he intended to formalize Nathan's position as the inheritor of the business and the house. She said it was fair. She said Nathan had been present. She said I had chosen my path. I said I had paid the mortgage on that house for 6 years. She said that was a loan. I said nobody ever called it a loan. She said they always intended to pay it back. I sat in that parking garage and watched the flickering light and let the silence settle, and then I called David Park, who had told me to call him when the moment came, and I said, "The moment has come. Tell me exactly what I do next." What I did next was request a family meeting. Not a phone call, not a holiday dinner where the conversation would be managed by proximity and my mother's ability to redirect any difficult subject toward the food. A family meeting explicitly called for the purpose of discussing my father's estate plans, which David advised me I was within my rights to request, and which he advised me to request in writing, so there was a record that the request had been made. I sent the email on a Thursday evening. I addressed it to both my parents. I kept it short. I said that I understood my father had made decisions about the estate, and that I respected his right to make those decisions, and that I also had information that I believed was relevant to those decisions, and that I was asking for the opportunity to share that information with the family before the decisions became final. My father replied the next morning. He said, "Maya, there's nothing to discuss. These decisions have been made carefully and they are final." My mother called that afternoon and said, "Honey, please don't make this difficult. You know how your father is." Nathan texted me that evening and said, "Sis, what are you doing?" I replied to all three of them with the same message. "I understand. I'm coming home on October 15th. I have some documents I'd like to share. I think it's important that we look at them together before anything is finalized." Then I booked the weekend off and I drove to Queens. I let myself in with my key. My mother was in the kitchen. My father was in his recliner, his hips still making him prefer the ground floor. Nathan was on the couch, his arms crossed. My mother had set out tea and the specific biscuits she put out when she was trying to make something feel civilized. I sat down across from my father. I put my bag on the floor. I took out the folder I had prepared, which contained printed copies of everything, organized chronologically and totaled at the bottom the way a chart is organized, and I placed it on the coffee table between us. My father looked at the folder and did not touch it. "Maya," he said, "I told you these decisions are made." "I heard you, Dad," I said. "I just need you to look at something before we close this conversation." I opened the folder and I turned the first page toward them, which was a summary sheet, 1 page, that listed every contribution I had documented with the date, the amount, and the total at the bottom. $41,680. My father looked at the page. He looked at it for long enough that I knew he was reading it, really reading it. not dismissing it. Then he said, "These were gifts," I said. "Some of them were given as gifts. Some of them were given in response to a specific request for help with a specific problem. The $18,000 in 2018 was given because you told me the mortgage was 3 months behind and you needed help. Would you like to see the text message where you described the situation to me?" He was quiet. I said, "The $400 a month starting in January 2019 was given because you asked me, in December 2018, whether I could contribute something regular to help stabilize things. You used the word contribute. Would you like to see that voicemail? I have the transcript." He was still quiet. My mother had her hands very flat on her thighs, the way she held her hands when she was trying to stay composed. I said, "Dad, I'm not here to take anything from you. I understand this is your house and your business, and you have the right to decide what happens to them. I'm here because the document I found in your filing cabinet describes me as not dependent on the family's assets, and I need the people in this room to understand that's not accurate. I have been a contributor to those assets for years. The fact that I did it quietly and without making you feel obligated to acknowledge it is not the same as it not having happened." Nathan said from the couch, "Maya, this is not what this family does." I turned to look at my brother. I said, "Nathan, I know you didn't ask for this. I'm not angry at you. I'm talking to Mom and Dad." I turned back to my parents. "I'm not asking to be added to the will," I said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm asking for something else. I'm asking you to tell me, in this room, whether the contributions I've made to this family matter, whether they count, whether they are part of what you think of when you think of your legacy. Because the document in that filing cabinet says they aren't. And if that's the answer, I need to hear you say it out loud, and then I need to stop." My father said, "Stop what?" I said, "Contributing. Sending money. Being the person you call when something is wrong and you need it fixed. I need to stop being that person, because that person isn't in the will and isn't at the table and isn't considered present, and I can't keep doing a job that doesn't exist as far as this family's official record is concerned." The room was quiet for long enough that I could hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen and a car passing on the street outside. My mother spoke first. Her voice was smaller than I was used to hearing it. "Maya, we didn't know it had gotten to that amount." I said, "I know. I never told you. I'm telling you now." She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Because in this family, when I have a need, I'm told I'm independent and I'll be fine. When Nathan has a need, the family meets it." I learned a long time ago not to announce my needs because announcing them didn't change anything. I just stopped announcing them and kept meeting yours. My father was looking at the summary sheet. He hadn't looked up from it since I'd turned it toward him. He said, without looking up, "Your name is not on the deed." I said, "I know." He said, "The business is not in your name." I said, "I know." He said, "I built those things." I said, "You did, and I helped you keep them. For years. Quietly. Because that's what I do." He looked up then. He looked at me across the coffee table and the folder and the $41,680 and the 34 years, and I looked back, and something passed between us in that look that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't an apology, not yet. It was something earlier than an apology. It was recognition. He said, "I need to think." I said, "Okay." Nathan came and sat in the chair across from me after my father went upstairs to rest. He said, "I didn't know about all of that." I said, "I know." He said, "The 2018 thing. I didn't know they called you." I said, "I know. You just weren't in a position to help, and I was, and so I did, and it became the arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is it too late to be a different kind of brother than I've been?" It was such an honest question that it surprised me into being honest back. I said, I don't know, but it's not too late to try. We had dinner that night, the four of us, and it was not comfortable the way family dinners are supposed to be comfortable, and it was not resolved the way stories are supposed to be resolved by the end of the night. It was just dinner. My mother's jollof rice and fried plantains and the specific fish stew that I had grown up eating and that still tasted when I was sitting at that table, like the best possible version of home, even when home was also the place that had hurt me most. 3 weeks later, my father called me on a Sunday morning. He said, "I've spoken to the attorney." I said, "Okay." He said, "Your name is going on the deed. 25%. I know it should be more, given what I know now. But Nathan has put years in here, Maya, and I need to honor that too. 25% of the house, and I'm putting the loan in writing, retroactively. What you sent us, I'm having the attorney document it as a loan from the estate, which means it comes back to you from the estate before the remainder is distributed. Every dollar. Plus interest," I said. "I have the transcript." He said, "Maya." I said, "Dad." He said, "You are your father's daughter. You should have been running this business." It was, I think, the most painful and the truest thing he had ever said to me. I said, "I know, but I built something else instead, and I'm proud of it." He said, "I know you are. I've always known. I just didn't know how to say it without it meaning something had to change." I said, "It did have to change." He said, "Yes, it did. It wasn't repaired." I want to be honest about that. A single phone call doesn't repair 34 years of a family's structural decisions. My name went on the deed, and the loan was documented, and Nathan and I began, slowly and imperfectly, to build something that was closer to a real relationship than the polite distance we'd maintained for most of our adult lives. My mother called me more often and asked real questions. But some walls don't come down. Some things that were built into the architecture for so long become part of the load-bearing structure, and you don't tear them down because the house would fall. You just learn where they are. You stop pretending they're not there. You build a door. I drove back to Philadelphia on Sunday evening, down the same highway I'd driven 100 times, and I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who carries things quietly. I thought about the patients I'd sat with at 3 in the morning, the ones who'd held on past the point where anyone expected them to hold on, not because they were told to, but because something in them refused to stop. I thought about what it had cost me to be the quiet one, and I thought about what it would have cost me to remain quiet forever, and I understood that both costs were real. The cost of silence had been paid for 34 years. The cost of speaking had been paid in one weekend in October. Neither one was free, but only one of them left me with something I could keep. My name on the deed, my money documented, and a father who finally, at 68 years old, had said out loud that I was his daughter in a way that meant something different than it had ever meant before. I am still a cardiac nurse. I still work nights. I still sit with people in their most fragile hours and keep my hands steady and my voice level and my charts accurate, because an accurate record is the only protection the truth has against the version of events that's more comfortable to believe. The $400 a month stopped in November. My parents haven't asked about it. I think they understand now that some arrangements end when the conditions that created them change, and that the change was owed. If you've ever been the one who showed up and wasn't counted, I want you to hear this. The record exists. You kept it even when you didn't know you were keeping it. The steady hands, the level voice, the money sent, and the hours given, and the crises quietly resolved. Those things happened. They are real. And the day you stop making them invisible is the day the room has to decide what it actually sees. Document the truth. Know your worth. And never, not once, Let anyone describe your contributions as independence. This has been Arama Never Sleep. Maya's story is one of thousands. Thousands of quiet people who carried their families on their backs and were told, by the people they carried, that they didn't need anything in return. If that is your story, even a little, I want you to know, the record exists. You kept it, even when no one was watching. And the moment you stop being invisible is the moment the truth finally has a room to stand in. Thank you for staying awake with me tonight. If this story reached you, share it with one person who needs it. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from so I can see how far this has traveled. And subscribe to Arama Never Sleep, because the stories don't stop, and neither do we.